Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're diving into something, well, it's a fascinating and really complex set of ideas. They claim to be a sort of grand, unified theory for, everything. Society, politics, even history itself.
So, let's start with the big question our source material really wants us to think about. What if? What if there's a hidden operating system running our world? Like behind the curtain of everything we see day to day. A really powerful set of rules that most of us never even notice. But it's shaping, everything.
Well, there's this sprawling collection of Russian texts that claims to have cracked the code. These writings, they came out of the late Soviet era, originally called the internal predator of the USSR. And they don't just dip their toes in. They present a complete, all-encompassing worldview. We're talking a radical redo of how to see everything, from our own psychology all the way up to the global chess game of power.
All right, Section 1, a blueprint for reality. So, what is this grand theory really? Let's get into the first building block.
It's called the concept of public safety, or KOB for short. Now, according to the sources we're looking at, this is way more than just another political theory. It's framed as a complete blueprint, not just for understanding reality, but for actively shaping society to line up with what it calls the objective laws of the universe.
Okay, moving on to Section 2, the four human psyches. See, to really get how KOB looks at society, you have to start with how it sees the individual. And that brings us to one of its most foundational ideas, the four types of human psyche.
So this framework basically says every person fits into one of these four structures. Think of it like a ladder you're meant to climb. At the very bottom, you've got the animal type, totally driven by instinct. A step up from that is the zombie, and here they mean someone guided by outside programming, like culture and traditions. Then you have the demonic type, who's driven by their own personal intellect and will. But the ultimate goal, the top of the ladder, is to become human. And in this context, that means being guided by your conscience, which the texts are very clear on. They equate it to having a dialogue with God.
And this quote really shows you how they use this idea as a tool to diagnose society. From the KOB point of view, the whole problem with late Soviet society was that the population was mostly stuck in that zombie psyche. People who were programmed to be dependents, just like the quote says, wanting all the benefits from the state, but not wanting any of the responsibility.
Okay, Section 3, a theory of control. So, if that's the diagnosis for individuals, what's the plan for managing whole societies? That question leads us right into the framework's universal theory of management.
This is what they call the Sufficiently General Theory of Management, or DOTU. And it's a big deal in this framework because it's presented as a universal formula for control. The claim is that you can apply it to literally any process you can think of, whether you're steering a massive ship or steering an entire civilization.
What's really interesting is how this theory makes management sound almost like a math problem. It's super simple. On one hand, you have the vector of state. That's just where you are right now, your current location. On the other hand, you have the vector of goals. That's where you want to be. And according to DOTU, management is nothing more than the process of shrinking that gap, that error, between your current state and your goal.
Section 4, the 6 priorities of power. So now let's take that management theory and blow it up to a global scale. This is where KOB introduces a really fascinating hierarchy. The argument here is that real power, real influence, it's not just about tanks and money. Nope. There are much deeper and way more effective levels of control.
Let's walk through this, starting from the bottom, from the least powerful priority. At number 6, the most basic level, you have military power, good old-fashioned warfare. Just above that, at 5, are what the texts call weapons of genocide. Think drugs, alcohol, things that weaken a population. Priority 4 is economic power, money. Getting more subtle now, number 3 is ideology, controlling the facts and ideas people believe. Number 2 is chronological power. This is about controlling the story of history itself. And then, at the very top, the most powerful and subtle tool of all is methodological power. This is about shaping a society's entire worldview, the very method it uses to think.
And here's the key takeaway from that hierarchy. The framework argues that sure, you can impose injustice with brute force. That's the 6th priority. But it's so much more effective, so much more lasting when you use those higher priorities.
It's like you can occupy a country with an army for a few years, but if you can change how its people see the world, you can control them for centuries.
Which brings us to Section 5, the envisioned social order. So where's all this going? What's the end game here? Well, the framework paints a really stark picture, a contrast between the world we have now and the world it thinks we should have.
The big problem with the world today, according to KOB's diagnosis, is something it calls crowd elitism. Basically, the idea that society is always split into two groups, a small, knowing elite and a big, ignorant crowd. And the goal, the solution, is to move towards an ideal called sobernost. Now that's a Russian philosophical concept, but it basically means a kind of spiritual collective unity where everyone harmoniously pitches in with their own unique talents for the good of all.
And this is where it all clicks together, you see. This ideal society, this sobernost, isn't something you can just force on people from the top down. No, the texts are very clear. It can only happen, it can only emerge when enough people climb that ladder and reach the human psyche. When they start living, like the quote says, under the dictatorship of conscience. That's what makes an individual truly human, and that's the only way to build that ideal society.
All right, last section. Section 6, the question of worldview. Let's wrap up this explainer on the concept of public safety by coming back to its most fundamental and probably its most challenging idea.
So, in the end, the KOB framework, and look, regardless of what you or I might think of its specific conclusions, it really forces us to grapple with a huge question. If the sources are right, and the ultimate battle isn't fought with armies, but with ideas, what does that actually mean for our world? The suggestion here is that the most important wars are fought over information, over worldviews, and that the most profound control system of all isn't out there somewhere. It's the one running inside our own minds.